What's up everyone, my name is Kelsey, welcome back to my channel. Today we are doing a book review. If you've been around here at all, you know that I don't usually do regular book reviews. I much prefer talking about books I love and trying to convince you to read them. I'll link to my explanation of that if you're interested. But basically it's because I don't like spending a lot of time talking about books I don't like. I'd rather just forget about them. But recently I read an advanced copy of a book that I dislike so much I need to rant about it. So the book I'm complaining about today is called Sex Positive, and it's written by Dr. Kelly Neff. And Kelly Neff is a doctor of psychology, and I did a little bit of reading about her because I was curious about her background after I finished this book and hated it so much. And she was a professor for a long time, but I think now she like hosts a show called The Lucid Planet, which I think is a podcast, and she appears on other people's shows as an expert in psychology. She's primarily interested in personal wellness and love and sexuality. That's what I gathered from the bios that I read. So real quick, before I get into the details, a couple of content warnings because this book is called Sex Positive, and it's a little bit about trauma. So obviously we'll be talking about sex, and then also there's some troubling language surrounding trans identity and brief mentions of rape, and there's quite a bit about medical stuff, but nothing graphic. I got this book from the publisher. It was an advanced copy to review, which was like a bad bet on their part. So I have some like organized initial thoughts that I have written down here that I'm going to go through, but also when I was reading this book, I just highlighted a whole bunch of shit as I was going. So when I'm done with like the neat organized part of the video, I'm just gonna like work my way through all the stuff I hated page by page in the actual book. I wish I had a beer for this. That would make this more entertaining. So Sex Positive is supposed to be about the cultural changes that are happening surrounding sex and the way our society, Western society, views sex and sexuality. That's what it's supposed to be about. That's what the summary makes it sound like, and the tagline is redefining our attitudes to love and sex, but realistically, it was more like the author's personal journey and things that she's gathered throughout the years. And there was a lot of the author personally comparing what she observes now versus when she was a teen, which I thought was an odd way to structure things. She also talks like sex positivity is like a done deal and we're just there now, but like realistically, there's a bunch of not sex positive things still happening in our culture, especially concerning not white people, and she doesn't really touch on that at all. I also think this book would have benefited a lot from like interviews with actual real people that she could have sat down and spoken to one-on-one. There are like quotes from celebrities and other leading psychologists, but nothing that felt really real and relatable, and nothing that felt like it related to the average person on a personal level, if that makes sense. So now like getting into the actual content of the book and some of the stuff she actually says, and this is within the first couple of pages, and I should have known then that I was going to have a lot of problems with this book because the line is, quoting here, "The best sex and the only sex in which we ought to participate as sex positive people is consensual sex." Which at its base doesn't sound like a terrible sentiment, but for someone, this woman has a PhD and she's talking about sex positivity in this whole book. So to even refer to any sexual activity that's non-consensual as sex is just like a bad move. There's sex, which is always consensual, and there's rape, which is not consensual. And the implication that rape is just non-consensual sex is just like a troubling thing in a book like this. There's a whole chapter, or it might be a whole section on queer issues, and she uses the acronym LGBTQIA+ issues, and honestly, it felt like she just did some light reading and some Google searches, and that's the level of information that she put in this book. It doesn't feel like any queer people read this for her, like she didn't have anyone beta read it or sensitivity read it, because there are a lot of things that are just not on the level of modern thinking that someone at her level of education and writing from such a place of perceived expertise is just not acceptable. Several times throughout the book, she uses the phrase men, women, and transgender people, which is just an incorrect way to talk about trans issues. I mean, trans men are men, trans women are women, so you just need to say men and women. And if you're specifically talking about issues that transgender people face, that's the only time you have to specifically call out transgender. If you're just talking about issues of men and women, that's all you have to say. You could also say men, women, and non-binary people, which is likely what she was going for, but that's a misstep. She also consistently uses female and male to describe men and women, just to like mix things up, I guess. But I really dislike discussing men and women that way because it excludes non-binary and intersex people, and it reduces men and women to their biology. And in a book about culture, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. She also uses the outdated term for gender affirmation surgery. So she uses instead sex reassignment surgery, which is an outdated expression. Again, just showing the fact that she didn't have queer people test read this. That's something that anyone even like a little bit versed in queer culture would have caught. Okay, and another gripe, and this is a personal one for me. In a section talking about being an ally to transgender people, which is like a great thing to address, but she says, don't forget, allies put the A in LGBTQIA+, which is just incorrect. The A in LGBTQIA+ stands for asexual, or aromantic, or agender. All of those would be acceptable interpretations. Ally is not an acceptable interpretation. It's great to be an ally, and I'm glad they exist, but they're not part of queer people. So once I came across this line, I was curious, and I'm like, okay, in this book about sex positivity, is she ever going to talk about asexuality if she so blatantly ignored the fact that it exists when talking about this acronym? So I did a search of the Kindle version, and the term asexuality does not come up at all, and neither does gray sexuality or demisexuality. And I don't understand how you could write an entire book about sex positivity and changing culture surrounding sex and not talk about those possible ways that sexual attraction would manifest. It just doesn't make sense. She also uses this line in a section about sexism. She says, sexism is gender blind because it can happen to men and to transgender people too, which is troubling first because it separates transgender people from men and women once again, and she leaves it at that. There's no discussion about the differences between the sexism that women face and the sexism that men face. There's no nuance. The author also talks about her teen years and how she has a lot of trauma from shame that was put upon her as a teen, and slut shaming and things like that. And she implies that because she never dealt with that trauma, it manifested in a physical illness, and it was the result. The result of that was hundreds of uterine cysts and required her to get an emergency hysterectomy, which is just a troubling thing to tell people in a book about sexual culture, that untreated sexual shame could result in a horrible physical manifestation. This story would have been a great time to talk about the discrimination that women still face when getting medical care, especially concerning problems with female-specific issues and anything that could be a result of perceived promiscuity. We've all heard stories about women that have told their doctors they have multiple sexual partners, or they're not only with one partner, or variations of that, and received judgment in return. And that's an interesting concept that could have been explored in a section of this book, and it was not. Okay, so those are all the points I wrote down, and I think that's everything I mentioned in my written review as well. So now I'm just going to go through all the things I highlighted, just section by section throughout the whole book. All right, so in the introduction of the book, she is talking about consent, which is great. The section is called Consent is Sexy, I would have to agree. But at the very end of this section, she's talking about male infant circumcision, which is definitely something that is relevant to this book and should be discussed. And obviously this is something that's pretty common in Western society, at least in the US, and it's not, medically necessary. But she finishes off this section with a sentence that says, and who knows, maybe if we stop the practice of removing sensitive parts of boys' penises without their consent, They will grow up to be more respectful of other people's right to consent. Just saying. Which is a horrific implication that circumcising your kid will lead them to not respect women, or worse, rape women, which is kind of an insane leap to make. In chapter 2, which is titled A Gender Fluid World, she discusses gender pretty in depth, but mostly incorrectly. There is a section earlier, which is important to point out, in chapter 1, which is basically an introduction to how media is portraying sexuality to us. But she says it is an incredibly exciting time to be alive when it comes to new ideas about masculinity and femininity, if those terms still have any meaning, that is. Which, even people that, I think pretty much everyone would tell you that masculine and feminine are still words with meaning, especially in regards to gender presentation. So it's an odd statement to make. And then in the A Gender Fluid World chapter, she says, still others are taking the rejection of gender norms even further by refusing to participate in the binary at all and self-identifying as something other than masculine or feminine. So this is something she does pretty often, where she is constantly telling us that the younger generations are breaking the gender binary and refusing to conform to traditional gender roles, but at the same time conflating masculine with man and feminine with woman. Even in this sentence, she says self-identifying as something other than masculine or feminine, when masculine and feminine are not genders. They can be methods of presentation. In the follow-up sentence, she says, more than ever before, we are turning away from the gender binary and defining ourselves as gender neutral, gender queer, gender fluid, or transgender, which I have a few problems with. First of all, I've never heard anyone identify as gender neutral. I've heard agender. Gender queer and gender fluid are both familiar to me, but gender neutral I am unfamiliar with, and I don't know if that's something missing from my repertoire or if she's just using the expression gender neutral very incorrectly. And my other problem with this sentence is that she once again says transgender is not a part of the binary, and transgender is not inherently non-binary. Trans men that identify as men are still on the binary. Trans women are still a part of the binary. So in this same chapter, in the next section, she is talking about gender identity and the difference between cis and trans, and I really feel like this whole section is a complete mess. She specifically uses an example of a fictional person, Andrew, and she says, like, literally this whole section could have been improved if she had actually spoken to a trans person, or even like a man with feminine traits could tell her that just because someone exhibits feminine traits, that does not mean they're transgender, and it doesn't mean they don't identify as a man. This is another example of her conflating the feminine and woman and masculine and man. But she says, Andrew might grow up with a masculine gender identity, meaning that his inherent sense of identity is normative because his biological sex and his gender identity match up. We would call Andrew a cisgender person, which is accurate. In the next section, she says, Andrew's example sounds fairly typical. However, Andrew may have embarked upon a different journey to express his gender identity, and this is the section. Maybe as a child, he was naturally drawn to playing with dolls instead of toy cars and took a liking to wearing dresses, which is an interesting way to display gender identity. And then it says, he may have always felt inside that he was meant to be born as a woman, which is something I've heard from a lot of transgender people, so that little bit is accurate. But then she finishes the sentences saying, identifying more deeply with a feminine gender identity. Once again, conflating femininity with womanhood, which is just not a very progressive view of gender. Okay, and here we are getting into one of my least favorite parts of this book, which is pretty much when I decided that I was going to dislike this book completely, and it was either going to get a 1 or 2 star rating from me because I have a lot of problems with this section. So this section starts by saying, the rise of a new type of category of sexual orientation is pushing us to understand sexual orientation in a more inclusive, gender-blind way. We're about to get biphobic, okay? She says, rather than bisexual being the only option, and she defines bisexual as attracted to both men and women, we now have the option of being attracted to multiple gender identities. I know a lot of bisexual people, and I don't know any of them that say bisexual means attracted to men and women. Most bisexual people would define bisexual as attraction to multiple genders or 2 or more genders, or they would say attracted to your own gender and other genders. The next paragraph says pansexual or omnisexual, which implies that they're the same thing, and they're not. Refers to the sexual, romantic, or emotional attraction to people regardless of their sex or gender identity, which is almost correct. Because I'm asexual and panromantic, I don't like the way she phrases this sentence where she says sexual, romantic, or emotional attraction, because those are different kinds of attraction, and most people would say if you're pansexual, you experience all of those kinds of attraction if you're not using a split attraction model, if that makes sense. Sorry, that was kind of a mess of an explanation. But attraction to people regardless of their sex or gender identity feels correct. Most people, most pan people I know, would describe pansexual as attraction to multiple genders where gender is not really a factor in attraction, that doesn't affect the way you're attracted to people, which is pretty much the only difference between pansexual and bisexual, where bisexual is attraction to multiple genders where gender is a factor, and pansexual is attraction to multiple genders where gender is not a factor. They broadly overlap, you know? But she finishes this section by saying, some see this as an alternative and more inclusive perspective than bisexuality because it includes attraction to not only cisgender men and cisgender women, but also attraction to people who are transgender, gender non-binary, third gender, agender, and so on. Which is biphobic and transphobic because it implies that transgender people are not men or women, and it implies that bisexual people are inherently transphobic, and it implies that pansexual people are inherently biphobic. This whole section is just a fucking mess. And I can't believe this is another reason why I don't think any queer people read this book before she published it, because somebody would have caught this. Like, I hope to God somebody would have caught this. Chapter 3 was interesting from like an informational aspect. It's all about how modern society and modern culture is incorporating technology into sex and how we perceive sex. I don't have a problem with the information she presented, but I think the way she talks about it is kind of a mess sometimes. I don't really have specific examples, but she does a lot of assuming that survey respondents, even when it's not specified, she assumes they're hetero, which is strange because Kelly Neff identifies as bisexual in this book. Chapter 4 is sex. It's called Sex as a Spiritual Experience, which as a person that's not really spiritual or religious kind of felt like a waste of a chapter. I mean, if that's something you're interested in, there might be some information in here you find interesting, but there's a lot. Like there's this one section, we use our sexuality through intercourse and procreation to connect to the divine energies out in the universe and pull them into our physical bodies to give them life, which just sounds like a whole bunch of bullshit to me and not very scientific. And I feel like this chapter could have benefited a lot from, once again, interviews with real life experience and studies, cultural studies, and actual information about how spirituality influences people's sexual relations, and this section does not. It's really a lot of personal experience from the author and drawing information from other published works. This is another time when she brings up her tumors and how she thinks that was a physical manifestation of her trauma. And I have a lot of problems with this section, especially this part where the end of this section, she says, looking back now, I sometimes wonder if I had to go through this entire experience just to grab that little gold nugget at the end of the rainbow, which offered me a sense of irrefutable proof that the sexual energy is real, but when it becomes blocked, it can manifest in the body as tumors, illness, or other types of illness, which that sentence doesn't even make sense. So, not only do I dislike this because it implies that your trauma can make you physically ill, which is not wrong, but in such a physical, unexplainable way. Like, we all know stress can have physical symptoms on your body. I have a hard time believing that it could literally cause tumors, enough tumors that would require an emergency hysterectomy. I have a hard time with that. I also think this section is low-key aphobic because it implies that not releasing your sexual energy is going to ruin your body. I'm a little bit personally offended by that sentiment. Chapter 5 is all about redefining orgasm, which was an interesting chapter, but once again got really into the spiritual stuff. Chapter 7 is called Right Partner, Right Relationship. And this is another section I had some problems with because a lot of this is taken straight from another book. It's like she's taking information from another book and explaining it to us in her book, which is a choice. But this is another section where I feel like asexuality and aromanticism would have fit right into this discussion and is an important part of this discussion, and she just doesn't bring it up. Okay, I think I'm gonna cut myself off there because I've been talking for like 45 minutes. And it's going to be a long video. Clearly, I don't recommend this book. I ended up giving it 1 star because even though some of the information was interesting, I feel like there's way more harm than good in this book, and I definitely would not recommend it. Don't read this book. But if you do read it, talk to me about it because no one else has read it, and I really want someone to complain about it with. If you like this video, hit like. If you want to see more, subscribe. I post book-related videos every Wednesday. If you want to keep talking, you can find me on Twitter or Instagram at Kelsey Reads or Goodreads at Kelsey Lynn Reads. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.